Good morning, everyone. My name is Imani Hinson. I am a 2020 graduate of Hofstra University, and I was also a fellow for the Center for Civic Engagement while I was at Hofstra, and I will be teaching at Brooklyn Uncommon Schools starting in the fall. So I just want to remind everyone to mute themselves as we go throughout our presentations, just to be aware of that. You can also submit any questions to the chat that we will answer after each of our two presentations. So now I'm going to introduce both Alan and Pablo. So Dr. Alan Singer is a professor of education and history at Hofstra University and a former New York City high school teacher. Dr. Pablo Muriel earned bachelor's, master's, and a doctorate degree at Hofstra. He teaches at Alfred E. Smith High School in the Bronx and is an adjunct instructor in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Technology. Alan and Pablo grew up in the same Southwest Bronx neighborhood near Yankee Stadium and attended the same middle school, although 30 years apart. They are authors of Supporting Civics Engagement with Student Activism, Citizens for Democratic Society. It'll be published by Routledge this fall. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Alan Singer.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alan, and again, I'm a professor of education and also of history at Hofstra, and I'm zooming from my home office in Queens because of the coronavirus quarantine, and I'm going to share my screen now if I could figure out how to do it, because basically I'm a little technologically inept. Some of my students call me a technosaurus, which is a dinosaur. Let me see, slideshow from the start. This is the cover to the book that Pablo and I wrote, and it's scheduled to be published by Routledge in October 2020. And we wrote it with help from a lot of our former students. And I was very glad to see some of them are on the program today. We'll embarrass Dawn Summer McShane because there's a whole chapter about her middle school class from Hempstead, and she could talk about it a little bit later. All right. Young people today confront a world they did not create with serious problems. The adults in their lives, parents, family, friends, teachers, and political leaders have been unable to resolve these problems. Swedish teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg warns, "Our house is on fire." Pablo and I consider ourselves lifetime political activists as well as teachers. The question we confront as teachers and activists is, how do we best prepare a new generation to be active participants in preserving and transforming democracy, generating solutions that meet the needs of people domestically, respect and heal the environment, and promote international cooperation to address the need of people across the globe. Climate change is not just a domestic issue. And one of the things we are discovering with the response to George Floyd's murder is that racism is also not just a domestic issue. The world's 5 hottest years were all recorded since 2015. In answer to these questions, Pablo and I argue that supporting student activism as teachers is a fundamental component of civics education and needs to be incorporated in grades kindergarten through 12. We are very inspired by student involvement in climate change activism, anti-gun violence campaigns, and the anti-racist protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. What distinguishes social activism from service learning is advocacy to change institutional policies, where the institution is a school district, a corporation, or a local, state, or national government. This is a picture of high school students from Portland, Oregon. They organized a campaign to get the Portland Board of Education to transform the curriculum, so they now have a curriculum that focuses on the issues of climate change. And they've also picked up the George Floyd anti-racism campaign. Collecting food and clothing after environmental disaster, hurricane relief, those are service learning projects. But they become social activism when students petition school or district officials to permit or even embrace student involvement. In Uniondale, following the Parkland killings, students wanted to get involved in the walkouts. The first thing they had to do was to convince school and district officials to support their campaign. That was social activism. Former United States Supreme Court Associate Justice Louis Brandeis is widely quoted saying, quote, "The only title in our democracy superior to that of president is the title of citizen." As teachers and citizens, Pablo and I agree with Justice Brandeis. We believe it is fundamental to our job as teachers to engage students in examining the implications of citizenship in a democratic society, which requires encouraging student activism as part of experiential learning. Even the youngest students can be involved. These 4 young women are 3rd graders from Oneonta, New York. Their math textbook credited Christopher Columbus with discovering America. They felt it was misleading, so they launched a petition campaign to get the publisher to change the workbook. And finally, the publisher agreed. And they're 3rd graders, they're 8 years old. In the United States, the National Council for Social Studies, in its college career and civic life framework, argues that producing knowledgeable, thinking, and active citizens is essential for the preservation of democracy. And as many of us worry, democracy is under threat here. This means that students need the intellectual power to recognize societal problems, ask good questions, and develop robust investigations into them. Students need to consider solutions and consequences. They need to separate evidence-based claims from parochial opinions, and they need to communicate and act upon what they learn. Learning is not just confined to the classrooms. Student mastery of civic ideals is measured, according to the National Council for the Social Studies, by their ability to apply a range of deliberative and democratic strategies and procedures to make decisions and to take action in their classrooms, schools, and out-of-school civic contexts. Pablo and I interpret act upon what they learn in out-of-school civic contexts as a call for informed student political action that teachers, schools, and school districts must support. Around the country, state standards in New York, New Jersey, California, Florida, and Utah explicitly cite student activism as a measure of their understanding of civic responsibility. This is just a page from the Utah Education Network, where it says civic engagement is one of the fundamental purposes of education. I got to move my picture so I can actually see what I'm looking at. And students are expected to engage solutions to these problems and share their ideas with appropriate public and/or private stakeholders. We're not just talking about the blue states here, but when you look at the state standards around the country, students are expected to become civic activists. There is a rich philosophic tradition in American education and other countries that supports student civic and political activism. In 1932, during the Great Depression, George Counts, a professor at Teachers College in New York City, issued a challenge to all teachers and all Americans: dare the school build a new social movement. Counts believed that schools could play a transformative role in creating a more just society. He called on educators to pay the costs of leadership, to accept responsibility, to suffer calumny, to surrender security, to risk both reputation and future, to promote progressive social change. Today, we are seeing students supported by teachers at the forefront of the anti-racist campaigns, of the anti-gun campaigns, and at the climate change campaigns. John Dewey, one of the most influential thinkers about education in the United States, offered suggestions for a pedagogy that makes it possible to engage students in changing institutions that appear as imposing and unchangeable. Key to Dewey's approach to education was recognizing there is an organic connection between education and experience. As an advocate for democracy, Dewey understood that students must experience democracy. I really like the chant as people are marching. They shout out, "This is what democracy looks like." Active citizenship in a democratic society means that students must personally experience the power of activism to understand its implications to the fullest. Brazilian educator Paulo Freire dedicated his life to supporting efforts by the world's poor and oppressed to acquire educational experiences to take control over their lives. Freire argued that progressive educational and social goals can only be achieved when students explicitly critique social injustice and actively organize to change oppression. And that is what we are seeing in the streets of the United States today. Student activism and its ability to contribute to the transformation to society is definitely not a new phenomenon. I was marching in the streets during the 1960s against racism and against the war in Vietnam, while both a high school and college student. Two of the most powerful examples of the role played by secondary school students in campaigns against racism were the campaign against apartheid in South Africa and in the African American civil rights movement. This is some images of the middle school and elementary school students campaigning against apartheid in South Africa, high school students campaigning against apartheid, and high school students fleeing after the police opened fire during their peaceful march. By 1976, much of the leadership of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa was either in prison or had been murdered by police and military forces. In June 1976, tens of thousands of school students marched in a Soweto protest against a government decision to force their schools to use Afrikaans as the language of instruction instead of English. What the students argued is that if they were only educated in Afrikaans, they could never leave South Africa with its racist policies. But if they were educated in English, they could travel to universities anywhere in the world to promote their struggle for equality. These students were brutally attacked by police who opened fire using live ammunition, and they murdered at least 176 young people, although estimates for deaths run as high as 700. The student protest and police response sparked international condemnation of apartheid and contributed to a downfall and majority rule in South Africa. In the United States, young children were at the center of the 1963 Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, and had a similar cathartic impact on the African-American civil rights movement. These students were attacked by dogs. These students were attacked by hoses. And all this was seen on national television. With adults threatened with losing jobs for participating in protests, and many of the movement's leaders jailed, including Martin Luther King, activists enlisted students, including younger children, for marches demanding the desegregation of Birmingham, Alabama's parks and public facilities. Hundreds of students were arrested on the first day of the campaign. On the second day, they were attacked by police with high-pressure fire hoses and dogs when they entered a whites-only park. The police assault, broadcast on television and widely covered in the press, was a turning point in the African-American struggle for civil rights in the United States. People, white people, could no longer ignore what was taking place. And I really want to recommend, there's a civil rights tour you can take of Alabama, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. It is a very powerful experience. Today, democracy itself appears to be at risk in many nations, including the United States. In a September 1820 letter, much maligned and deservedly so, former President Thomas Jefferson argued that an educated people were the best defense of democracy and liberty in the new nation. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a hopeful, wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. What Jefferson, a slaveholder, did not predict is that 40 years later, informed citizens, including 200,000 African Americans, would fight to end slavery in the United States. Perhaps the best known statement demanding activism in response to injustice was by Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller after World War II. And I'd like to read this statement in the form of a poem. Niemöller writes, "In Germany, the Nazis first came for the communists, and I did not speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I did not speak up because I was not a Catholic. Then they came for me. And by that time, there was no one to speak up for anyone. And I think that has motivated many of the marchers in the anti-racist movement today, because young people, whites, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans have said, I have to speak up before they come for me. With Jefferson and Niemöller, Pablo and I recognized that political injustice cannot wait until high school or college, after high school or college, but must be made as injustice arises. Our hope in supporting and promoting student activism is to encourage a new generation of pro-democracy, pro-environment, pro-humanity activists. At the January 2019 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Greta Thunberg accused political and economic leaders of the world of bragging about their success stories, successes that came with an unthinkable price in environmental destruction. However, Greta believed, and we share her belief, there is still time to turn everything around, because Homo sapiens have not yet failed. Thank you for joining us today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Pablo.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's a pleasure, everyone. Thank you for being here. So just piggybacking on what Alan Singer, Dr. Singer just finished explaining. So I'm going to take it back a little bit. I'm going to go back to the very beginning when I was a student at Hofstra. I was an undergrad, and I was going into law school. I think that was my path. I was a history major, and then I met Alan, and it was a coincidental thing. Dr. Eisenberg was my advisor, and she told me to go see Dr. Alan Singer, and I could change up, I can use him as a advisor because she was very busy, and she said go see him. And then our conversation, I remember meeting him very briefly. I'll just jump through it. And the first thing he asked me was, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I just need you to sign I'm sorry, Alan.
Paperwork."
Yes, it was. Yes, it's just to simply get me into the class I needed to get into. And our conversation started, and his question was very simple. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, I really want to go to law school." He said, "Why?" And I said, because I come from a very tough neighborhood. I'm from the housing projects, and most of my friends are either dead or in jail. And I want to make sure that there's a check on that. And Alan said to me, "Well, why don't you do something else, like catch them before they go to jail and stop them?" And I said, "How's that even possible?" And he said, "Become a teacher." And I started laughing, because what I remember from teaching was being given a bunch of sheets and being told, "Oh, fill this out." And most of the information did not necessarily correlate with the real world. So Alan said, "Well, be a different teacher." And so I said, "Let me try this." The minute I became a teacher, I took it as a minor, because I was a major in history. And Alan said, "Take secondary ed as a minor." So I did so. And I decided the last 18 credits, rather than take pottery and whatnot, I was going to do secondary ed, just as something to pass by, to pass through. I actually ended up liking it. And I said, let me try this for at least a year or two. Problem was, when I got into the school that I started working, which was University Heights, it was a beautiful little building inside of the Bronx Community College, but the building was almost completely abandoned inside. I mean, it was to the point where I was teaching a class, and this was one of my first memories of teaching. And I'm teaching a class, and it's my first week. And I see all the kids jump up on top of the table. And I'm thinking, oh, they're trying to play a trick on me. What's going on? And the girls, even the boys jumped up on the table and said, no, keep going, Pablo, we're listening. And I said, no, what's going on? They said, oh, it's because of the mics. Every time they come out, everybody jumps up on the table. And I said, are you serious? So I started, and there were mice. this is a real thing. And then the auditorium, they called it the shush room, because they weren't allowed to use it, but they would, because the only space they had. But when it rained inside the auditorium. So I remember calling Alan and saying, "This is ridiculous. I've never seen anything in these conditions. What can I do with this?" And Alan said, "Well, see if we get them to want to do something about it." So I said, "You know what, Alan, I'm going to try this, even if I get fired, I'm just going to do it." And so I started working with the kids, and I used. I was teaching social studies. I was teaching 2 different courses. I was teaching U.S. history and participation in government, and I used it as a springboard. I said, "Okay, guys, what's going on? Why is this happening?" And the kids have theories. So I said, "Why don't we do this?" And we started going step by step. Let's start to who are your local elected officials? Let's identify them. Let's write them a letter. Let's call them. Let's visit. And we took all those steps. I did not know it was going to spiral to the point where the kids took it upon themselves at a certain point, where they started to visit these elected officials on their own, and they started to lobby them. They didn't even know what lobbying was. They would just show up at the lobby and request things from these people. The fight took on a different outlook, and before we know it, we had elected officials in the building. They recognized the deplorable conditions, and they allocated over, I think it was $5 or $6 million to fix the building. And we got a new auditorium, and we got new classrooms, and now the kids are going into a school inside of a college, and it's like an oasis outside of this devastated area in the Bronx. So they did this, and it was a great success. And from 2004 to 2006, we fought hard, and they got it. By 2007, the building was set. We had new classrooms, new lunchroom, new auditorium. And then in 2010, the college comes to us and says, "You've done a wonderful job with this school. Thank you. Wow, this building looks amazing. But now you guys have to go. We need it back." And so they transferred our school from the inside of a Bronx Community College to the South Bronx, across the street from a juvenile detention center. It's called Safe Horizons. And so the kids prior to that started fighting some more, because at that point I called Alan and I said, "All of this fighting, and we look at, we just lost the building." And Alan said, "Well, use this as a springboard. Let's see if the kids will want to see what's going on. How do we commit to more change? How do we use this in a positive way?" So then we started to go to PEP meetings, which were a panel for educational policy created by Bloomberg, which was basically Bloomberg appointees giving authenticity to something that was a rubber stamp. So the kids knew this. I went on my own to one of them. Then I started inviting the kids as sort of an extra credit project if they wanted the extra credit. And it started off with 3 or 4 kids showing up. Next thing you know, I had a class of, I teach 110 kids. I had about 80 kids showing up to PEP meetings. And we started going to PEP meetings in other schools that had nothing to do with us. The kids would just say, regularly, "Hey, Pablo, can we go to this PEP meeting?" They would redo the research for me, for themselves. And I say, "Absolutely, let's go." So we ended up going to Brooklyn. And one of the funny things was, I thought this was, I said this would be the end of my career here, because in 2010 or 2011, Kathy Black was appointed by Bloomberg, and we went to Brooklyn Tech, and my students all went. I invited I said to a class, "If 5, 6 people want to come, I'm going to show up," and my entire class showed up. 110 kids showed up. I can't believe it. And then when she would talk, they would disrupt. And then everyone started disrupting. Next thing you know, it was on channel 11 and channel 4 and channel 1. I'm like, oh my God. And you see my kids with signs screaming and not allowing Kathy Black to speak, and then everyone joining in. And I said, at some point, so this is part of the activism. So fast forward. So after this ended in 2012, in 2010, 2011, we also had Occupy Wall Street going. And a lot of my kids also started to join that. and they started to go there and they started to be a part of it, and so on and so forth. So what I did with Alan, when I started my PhD, I said to Alan, I find something here that is incredible. I think activism can really motivate young people to go further and to take this abstract notion and give us some practical element to it and motivate them. And again, I haven't explained my population. It's 93% Title I, which means almost every single family is on some sort of welfare, food stamps, Social Security. They're on government assistance. So it's an impoverished school in an impoverished area. So when we talk about poverty-stricken school, my school, both my schools that I've worked at, are at the epicenter of this impoverished, this impoverished schooling. And these young people just started moving forward. So what I did was I followed 5, and it was originally, here are the 5 students that were part of Occupy Wall Street. And I want to see how activism has helped them, because these kids were not, statistically speaking, they fit all of the criteria. They were impoverished. They were from the housing projects, single family households. Almost every single one of them, they were African American, Puerto Rican, Honduran, a half Puerto Rican, half Black, and a Dominican. 3 young women, 3 young ladies, and 2 young men. And the whole goal was just what got them there. Interesting enough, because I kept going, just following them, and they stood in touch with me, I followed all of them into their adulthood. And not only 3 of them went to Hofstra, and they all graduated. One of them is still here. I believe he might be in here now. And all 5 of them are back in their communities as teachers. One of them works for Disabilities USA, and her job is to assure that the funds that go to disabled people actually go to disabled people. So all 5 of them, they fit the criteria of kids that statistically couldn't make it. They were extremely active, and all 5 of them are now adults and are teachers back in the South Bronx. And so this was partly, this is all in the book, and I kept going with them, and I'm still in touch with them. And this just to add to currently, to what's happening now. So recently, when Greta Thunberg actually went to Manhattan, I told my principal, my kids are actually following this closely, and they're gonna go. I think they're gonna go. And when Mayor de Blasio gave the okay for the students to go, my principal thought that the students would just go home. He said, Pablo, then they're just gonna go home. I said, okay. The next day, and I'll show it in a few minutes. The next day, all of my students showed up to the Greta Thunberg to the climate strike, and I'll show that in a few minutes. And it was extremely motivating to them. Every single one of them has kept up with some sort of activism on their own, even from this. And then COVID happened, and so there were riots and protests and looting in the Bronx, and it was all over the news. And on June 2nd, I actually put up on Facebook. One of my students sent me from an organization saying, we're going to clean up the Bronx, and in the morning. So I said, absolutely, I'm going to go right away, and I'm going to go in the morning. And so myself and my wife decided we're going to get in the truck and we're going to go to Fordham Road. When we get to Fordham Road, and I put all the pictures up, my God, it was incredible. It was incredible. The Bronx was cleaned up by 9:30. And when I say cleaned up, I mean cleaned up. There were people, a bunch of community came out cleaning up. And what was interesting in one picture that I took, it was so coincidental, and I have it on the Facebook. I was kind of scrolling to show it. I took a picture of a gentleman in the middle of Fordham Road. His bumper came off, and then the cleaners were actually stopped cleaning, and went to the middle of the street, picked up the bumper and put it to the side to help the person, which is a beautiful act of kindness. And one of the kids commented, "Pablo, that's me in the blue jeans." And that was one of my activists. And I said, "Oh my God, that's great. What are you doing?" And then another kid who was also who was on Facebook, who was also an activist, she said, "Yeah, I see you." Oh, you know, and it was very beautiful in that sense, where they were going back and forth, you know, on this. And these are students that graduated 8 to 10 years ago, and they're still committed to their activism. So there was a very strong sense of what is, you know, what is possible with activism. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to share that the pictures, Alan. Is that okay?
Yeah, and then we'll open it back up to people.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I just wanted to let me show everyone this for a second here. Hold on, just so it can make sense. So I create. Sorry, this is on a side note. It's the reason is because I created this. Okay, where is it? Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, so by the way, because of COVID, one of my former students is at Hofstra, is doing his student teaching, and he actually did student teaching with me, and he helped me. Well, we came up with the idea, and he helped me put this together, which is an entire website using Google Sites. And so what I did to motivate the students, I actually put it up. These are the COVID. Hold on, sorry. I actually put it up here. This was during the strike, the climate strike. And you're gonna see a bunch of my kids in here. These are my kids. they're hood kids, but you know, and those are some of their signs. And so I put a bunch of them up here. So as you guys can see, I put it on a scrolling so they could see it, because these are the pictures that they sent me as they were doing this. And there are a lot more pictures, but I only put those up. So let me. How do you stop sharing? Oh, stop sharing. Got it. Okay. So I'm going to open it up for questions.
I'll turn it back to Imani.
All right, so we have a few questions that people have entered into the chat. So I will start with Sydney's. So it says, how can we balance student activism and protest when police forces are using lethal or very aggressive force, since we should be wanting to keep students safe?
I'll start. No, it's a fundamental question. When I was a high school teacher, before we participated in anything, I always met with the students. And I also always required they have a parental consent form. And we talked about what were the rules that we were going to follow at this activity. And one of the rules is that we had to stay together. And if there's a problem, someone had to report to me or one of the other chaperones. And they had to agree in advance that if I decided we were leaving, they were going to leave. And if they couldn't agree to that, they couldn't come. There was, again, we had one incident, we went to a budget hearing and they kept us waiting for hours. And finally I said to the students, I'm gonna go up and seize the microphone. But before I do, you have to agree. If they give us permission, you will come up and speak. And if the police grab me, you're all gonna walk out, because the only way I can get in trouble is if something happens to you. There were also demonstrations where I said to the students, I can't take you. In 1987, there was a march in Howard Beach, Queens, when two black men were attacked by a white mob and one ended up getting killed. And I said, it's not going to be safe, I can't take you. So student safety was always a priority, and students who participated with me had to agree in advance what the guidelines were for what we would be doing.
Thank you, Alan. Pablo?
And taking what Alan said, because Alan said those exact words to me back in 2010. And I remember taking the kids. I was just the UFT chapter leader at my school for about 10 years. And I took my kids to UFT to UFT rallies when we were rallying in front of City Hall against Bloomberg. Now, interesting enough, when we were in front of City Hall, sometimes I'm fortunate to say this, but our own colleagues need to sometimes step it up, because out of 80,000 teachers, we had maybe 6,000 to 7,000 there. It should have been a lot more. And so it was great, but it was a little boring. So the kids said, Pablo, can we walk around? I wanted them to see what a rally looks like, sponsored by that. And as we're walking to Water Street towards the train, we're starting to leave, suddenly we see a rush of people just coming, and then suddenly like cop cars and like tactical gear. And I was there with my wife and about 8 kids, 2 of which are in the book. And I didn't mention this. It's just out of memory. And I remember that they immediately, it happened in a matter of like 5 minutes, where barriers came up. We were stuck on the side of the water because we had already crossed. We were closer to the train, but then everything all of a sudden got locked down. And my fear was exactly what Alan said. And I had spoken about that with them, but I didn't think that was going to happen. And so what I did was I surrounded I put my students behind me, the 5 of them, and I told them, step back, because at one point the cops came in aggressive and the protesters started pushing back at the cops, and it was a push fest. I'd never experienced that in my life. And that was the beginning of Occupy Wall Street, because it was literally across the street from Zuccotti Park where we were. And then we see people marching down and all of this happening. So what I would suggest is exactly what I did, exactly what Alan just said. And if you're going to go to rally, make sure that the kids understand that it is a rally. It's going to seem insane. It's going to seem, but if they're there with you, you are, even though it's after school and all, I feel responsible because those are my kids and they came down there because I asked them to. So ultimately, I have to make sure that I'm not in any danger, but my kids are always behind me in a situation of that nature. So, and it's happened several times already. At this point, I know exactly what to do because I've been in it several occasions, but the first time was very, very scary because, again, I've never experienced something of that nature.
All right, thank you both. Our next question is, how should someone deal with the depression and anxiety that comes along with fighting for a cause? When it comes to racism and global warming, there have been very few wins over the decades, although important. So is there a way to not feel demotivated or eventually give up just because it seems like no one in power is listening to you or taking the appropriate action? I know these issues are literally about life and death, but because of the lack of progress, I can't help but sometimes feel deflated and even contemplate that nothing will change.
That's a hard one. I was at the 2004 Republican Convention protest in Manhattan with a large student delegation. And one young woman asked me, after we were standing there for a long time, how long have we been marching? And I laughed and I said, for 40 years. And she said, no, Alan, I'm serious. How long have we been marching? And I said, I'm serious. I've been marching for 40 years. Now it's like 60 years. If you look back at the civil rights movement, Montgomery boycott happened in 1955. The freedom rides are 1961. The March on Washington is 63, some are 65. There are long gaps between these major activities. And what I've argued, and this is also part of my research, is you can't just have flash mobs at protests. You have to build permanent organizations because the excitement is going to be depleted after a while. And you need the organizations that people like King built to sustain the movement during the slow points. So I always stress the importance of building organization.
As Alan said, it is very difficult. I come from a different perspective. I teach a lot of kids who poverty at times, a lot of my kids suffer from PTSD. We may not think they do, but many of them do, because growing up in poverty, you're not shielded from anything. You're in fact, everything you're experiencing from a very young age. What I found with my students is that activism actually helped their depression, because it helped them. It took away that powerlessness. I cannot talk for clinical depression. I can only talk for what's obvious. I'm not an expert in that field at all. But my observations have been that the kids who display those signs almost always find a home in activism, because they don't feel powerless anymore. And a lot of them, and again, this brings me to today. One of my students, she was a teen mom. While she was in school, she led in 2010, Bloomberg decided he's going to try to cut Metro cards. This young lady led an entire school walkout to go to Manhattan and protest it. She took video and everything. When she graduated from 2010, I hadn't seen her ever again. This morning at 5 a.m., I get an inbox saying, "Hey, Pablo, how are you? How's everything? It's Maria Ruiz from your class. I hope you remember me." I'm like, "Of course, you were the one who led the protest." She was like, "Yeah." And then she's on Channel 1 News, because when the COVID thing happened, she started a chicken farm in Howard Beach. And she's given eggs to the elderly that live around, because they can't go she's growing vegetables and all that. And she was featured as the person of the week for Channel 1 News. And again, this just happened this morning from 5:30 to about, 8 a.m. And I sent it to Alan. I was like, "Look at this. This is strange." And but this is a kid from years ago. Another one that I have is a lawyer, and she's actually investigating the 34th precinct. She started this whole movement because there seems to be racial tensions over there. And it looks like the 34th precinct gave some permission to certain groups to patrol their areas. And there were there's a video surfaced of some African-American kids being chased out of the area. And so she decided she's gonna look into it, and reporters already reached out to her, and this is all on Facebook. And she's actually going through the motions now of, she reported it to all the elected officials. She reached out to the precincts. So she's doing the activism from the ground level using social media platform. And it looks like it's really effective. So again, I know this is about depression, but I'm trying to explain that, this is ways of the certain groups. These protests can actually be beneficial, I believe, more so.
Just on that as well, I think as a person of color, we don't like to say when we're dealing with things, but it's okay to deal with things. So if you're frustrated or whatever, having feelings about all that's going on, that's okay to do that. And it's also okay to get therapy if you need that. Okay, next question. And it's from Allison. It says, "I teach at a Catholic school with a conservative audience. How do I support student activism without seeming to endorse quote unquote liberal ideas like environment, gun control, and civil rights? It's hard to appear to be balanced, not too many cut taxes for the wealthy rallies."
When I was a high school teacher, and this is something we featured in the book, I would set up a student club. In the student club, we called it the Forum Club, and it was a club where students explored controversial issues in the contemporary news and then took stands and became activists on it. One year, I think it was 1989, when the Supreme Court was discussing Roe v. Wade, the students wanted to get involved in that. And we organized a school forum. We brought in two speakers. One of the speakers was from the National Organization of Women. She supported reproductive freedom. And the other speaker, and we had them come on different days so they would engage with the students, not with each other, was from an organization called Birthright. And she opposed, she opposed both contraception and abortion. And so because the club brought in speakers from different points of view, it made it possible for students to be engaged in this. And it also addressed the idea that there were alternatives that they could debate. Interestingly enough, at one point we brought in a speaker from the African National Congress to discuss apartheid in South Africa. And school administrators raised, well, what about the other point of view? I finally said, I don't think there's another point of view on apartheid. But again, through the club, we brought in speakers to discuss different ideas with the students.
Same thing with Alan. And let me just add, I did everything Alan is saying too. I did this for years. And let me add one other thing. This is always a question I get. How many letters to file have you gotten? And how many times have you been suspended or anything? Interesting, I've never gotten one letter in my file, ever. And in fact, do I get pushback? It's perceived pushback. And what I mean by that is what the administrators, they like what I do because they know how to engage them, but to protect themselves, they put up this this sort of front, we're staying away from him and his actions. But as long as you are responsible, and what I mean by responsible is there are two points of views to everything. There are many points of views, but you have to be realistic. Am I going to bring in the point of view of a white nationalist? No, I'm not. I'm not going to bring a white supremacist into the classroom. It's not going to happen. I don't want to even know their point of view. Similarly, I don't want to know the point of view of any radical all the way they will drag my kids to an unproductive place. So as long as you're responsible, the kids will balance, it will balance itself out as long as you are responsible. And that's how I've always been managed to do it without any hesitation. However, there is always pushback. Let me say this. You will be uncomfortable. Alan says it's cookies, the cookies are, for example, with me, it's more along the lines of, okay, so you're not going to get the same classroom. You're going to have to move around twice this semester. And like, for example, this year, because we led a metal detector initiative at my school, and it got a lot of attention several years ago, I was given 4 different grades. So I was given 4 different grades and 3 different subject areas. And the teachers, my colleagues said, Pablo, that's insane. You're being punished. I said, punished? I'm able to touch more kids now. Now I'm able to get them from freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Then I'm able to learn a lot more from a very early age. So while some may see it as complaints or attacks, I see it as feedback and challenges. And it's been extraordinarily productive in that sense.
Another trick is when I had the students involved in political action, we always sent out press releases. Schools love good press. Dawn, are you here, Dawn?
Yes.
Why did you tell them about the freedom walkers we did from Hempstead to Garden City?
Yeah, that was in 2011. So I don't know how many of you are aware of its location. Hempstead and Garden City border each other. It's so starkly different that when the children see me as a small white woman in the classroom, they look at me and they ask if they assume I'm from Garden City. Every year, that's the question I get, because they see they have them, they're in their school in Hempstead, and they assume that all white people live in Garden City. And they're aware of the demographics of Garden City compared to the demographics of their school in Hempstead, which is almost, I want to say, almost close to 70% Latino now, and 30% African American. So they also are aware of the fact that their school doesn't have the same resources. They always ask why they can't have the computers that Garden City has, or nice desks like Garden City. They've never actually been inside Garden City, but they make those assumptions because they see the neighborhood and they see the opportunities that those students have. So what we did in the spring of 2011, it was the 50th anniversary, Alan had mentioned before, of the Freedom Riders that tried to integrate public transit down south. What we did with our students who are 8th graders is we decided to walk to the border of Garden City and Hempstead, which is about a mile from our school. And then we continued to a town park, Grove Street Park in Garden City, and we had a picnic. I do recall, Alan, we invited Garden City students, but they declined. But it was featured in Newsday very positively.
And that was the key. We informed
Yeah.
Garden City we were coming, and the Newsday was coming with us. So they were very nice and very responsive.
Yeah.
People like good public relations. Hempstead was happy, Garden City was happy, but the key was that what made it possible for us to do it was that Newsday came as well.
By the way, I did the same thing, but with Alan, he did the Huffington Post. So every time I did something, I would send it up to Alan, and Alan, if he would publish it, he would talk about the kids and what they were doing, and then I would bring it back and say, look, we're doing positive things, you know. So there was never really a question on it. One other thing I want to mention, and this is very important, you just mentioned it at a micro level, me more at the macro level. We're extremely segregated. So another thing that's very difficult is for impoverished kids to see something that they've never seen, you know. So for example, and I thank the Civic Center for this and the Cultural Center both, Alan has introduced me to them, I think when I graduated in 2001, and ever since, I think from 2003 and on, or 2004, every year I'm invited by both the Civic Center and the Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins, and I believe it's the other person is here from the Cultural Center, from the Civic Center. And what I did, I used that forum because it's an intellectual forum, it's opened up to the community. And I used that forum for several things, to get the kids out of the South Bronx and show them, look, something like this exists. Here's a college, here's a university. And then I give them an open ground to the university every year. Go walk around the college. I'll meet you guys back over here in a couple of hours. And one of my students, for example, was accepted to Yale. He's a Gates Millennium. And because of that trip, he decided I'm gonna go to Hofstra instead. And he literally turned down Yale for Hofstra. And so, you know, the kids every single year has said the same thing, that going to Hofstra, to those open forums with the Civic Center, with the Cultural Center, with all those various topics that they touch on, and the experience itself actually has a huge impact on them and has pushed them to go to college. Every single one of my classes, almost 100% of them go to college. As far as the completion rate, most of them have. I'm not in touch with all of them, but almost every single one I've bumped into has graduated at some point.
Thank you both. And just sort of backing off of, or going off of the back of Pablo, Hofstra in that sense definitely promotes civic engagement. Being in CCE, we have done a lot. I started off in CCE, working with Hempstead High School also. So doing that sort of stuff definitely helps. So the next question, we're gonna have 2 more questions and then we're gonna wrap it up with Alan. How can we also make student activism available to students with disabilities or students who have difficult home lives?
I mean, Pablo can address that. That's what Pablo does.
Yeah, I mean, repeat it again, because go ahead.
How can we also make student activism available to students with disabilities or students who have difficult home lives?
This is a difficult one, because you know, special needs runs the spectrum. You can do, for example, my wife teaches kids with autism and kids with disabilities, and she uses various techniques to sort of introduce them to topics that seem out of their reach, but they understand. I have kids that are considered some functional illiterates. And what I find is that the activism is actually much more powerful than anything that I could do in the classroom, if that makes sense. So from the very beginning, again, being appropriate with it, because you have a lot of different social emotional issues, including any disability.
That's so funny.
Just assure that you know their disability, and then be, you know, find the appropriate material that you can give them. And if they are going to join, like some are joined with me, the kids with special need, I will have them closer to me, and I will call their parents, even if they were 18. I would say, listen, do you mind? He wants to go with me to this rally. Of course, you know, and here's my number. So I will stay in touch with the parent, because my whole thing is to immerse them in the experience, but in a safe way. So yes, kids with disabilities, they should not be excluded. In fact, I think they should be included, but just much more thoughtful, and just, much more careful, and remember that, ultimately treat them as if they were your own child. So again, I take them with me, and they're going to, I'm going to take full responsibility. I know it sounds crazy, but again, I've done this for 19 years and it's been successful. And I teach all my classes are inclusion, almost all of them.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, last question. It says, as a social studies teacher, I have always placed a tremendous amount of importance on presenting the curriculum through various lenses and keeping my own political views private. Our role is not to indoctrinate, but to promote critical thinking skills and guide students through the process. At the same time, we want to promote the participation part of the curriculum and encourage students to become active citizens, whatever their political beliefs. How do you balance instruction to promote activism without discrediting those that disagree with you?
Again, what I did as a high school teacher is I organized a student club where the issues would be brought up. And that was a voluntary activity. Many of the students became involved, but it was voluntary. And it was in the student club that these issues were debated and students became involved. One of the things that then happened is students then brought the things we were discussing back to their classes and introduced it in the classes where they were students. And that gave them a tremendous sense of empowerment. I was, after we had the debate over choice, the club decided it would attend a rally in Washington, D.C. supporting reproductive freedom. And at a faculty meeting, some teachers said to me, well, you wouldn't have brought kids to an anti-choice, anti-abortion rally. What about that? And I said that my responsibility as a teacher was not to attend a rally I didn't agree with, but my responsibility was to make it possible for students who took that position to participate. Before we brought the students to the pro-choice rally the year before, I had arranged for some of the students in the club to attend a rally with students from Queens College. And what I said was, if there were students who wanted to attend an anti-choice rally, I would have looked for a faculty member to take them, or else I would have made arrangements with them to participate with a community organization or with the local college. My responsibility was to make it possible for different ideas to be introduced and to make it possible for students to participate. But that didn't mean I had to join them in an activity I didn't support.
I take the Ferrarian model, again, with Alan, I take the Ferrarian model, which is problem posing. And every day I start all my classes with current events. First, let me say, I think it's impossible to indoctrinate a kid in 40 minutes. And when they have 8 other classes, unless you're the sole teacher that's doing anything, which I doubt I'm the only one. So it's almost impossible to do so. And if they're gonna, Alan always says this, if they're gonna go to your class and agree with you, then they're gonna go to the next class and agree with the next person, and then the next person, the next person. They're kids. They don't really have a fixed ideological position yet. I leave everything up to them, as Alan said. I present it to them, and I let them in class. My class becomes a sort of a place for dialogue. So I make sure that out of 5 days a week, I use 3 days for a dialogue. So that means 2 of those days I'm throwing in a lot of technical stuff, a lot of literacy work, a lot of content, and then we start to debate it. So here I have some kids that, you know, may look dangerous, you know, they're little tough kids, and they go to these rallies, and then people, you know, think, oh, why are you here? And they'll engage them, and they're surprised every time that these kids are there and understand everything that's happening, and they're there purposefully. And I think that's the beauty of it all. So yes, if you want to balance out, I always say this to the students that are also going to be teachers. Also recognize the community you're going to work for. To go into a conservative community and start to teach radical, it's you know, I mean, it's brave, I assume, but I know I wouldn't keep my job for too long because that's not the ideological position of that school. But if you go to a school that's more progressive, then you can do those types of things with ease. It's not to say that you have a carte blanche to do so, but you can. So I think that the major point in this is just giving them the opportunity to jump in whichever direction they want to go into. I have many students who are pro-life, and they will fight with the pro-choice kids because I have some religious kids, and not fight, but debate. And it's interesting. I've never had a parent call me and discuss that. In fact, I've had parents call me, two parents that I could recall, and I thought it was going to be to complain about the subject matter of pro-life and pro-choice. And they called me to say, thank you so much for opening that up because we don't know much about it at home. And, we're devout Christians. But I'm glad that my son was exposed to that. And I was like, oh, well, I'm sorry if it offended. No no offense, Pablo. Thank you so much because these are, so I think if you're responsible with it, it's well-intentioned, you're not going to have a problem. But if you have like a hidden, intention in there, that's where the problems rises. And also, I let the kids debate. My job is to facilitate and go wherever the kids want to go with the subject matter I'm giving them. Again, that's not mine, that's Ferrari's problem posing. It's called critical pedagogy.
So I guess we're going to close it up now. In New York City, where I live, you don't have street creds unless you can rap. And the kids in New York City, they know me as the rapper Reese's Pieces. And they call me Reese's Pieces because I'm better than Eminem.
No, hold on. He did this in the South Bronx. I want you guys to know that a bunch of my kids in the South Bronx love this. So I just want to let you know.
I'm not very good. But anyway, this is Reese's Pieces. Climate catastrophe, George Floyd memory, Parkland students die, we must all ask why. COVID makes us sit at home, makes it hard for us to roam, but never forget the biome. That's why I wrote this poem. School is a place to learn so you can make the world churn. Join with Greta and me and maybe save democracy. Thank you for attending. This is Reese's Pieces.
Thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful rest of your day.